Hello and welcome to Web Development Fundamentals. My name is Gaurang and today we are going to talk about CSS Display property. This video is part of a multi-part series where I teach web development fundamentals in a beginner-friendly way. So if you want to check out the playlist, the link is in the description. And so without any further delays, let's get started. So in the last video, we saw how block and inline elements are displayed on the page. Block elements are rendered and take up 100% of the width, and inline elements are rendered in the same line and the width matches the width of the content. This is known as normal flow or flow layout, where elements are displayed on the page before making any changes to their layout. Now we can modify this flow using CSS property called display. Basically, display CSS property sets whether an element is treated as a block or inline element, and it also allows us to change the layout for its children. That means we can convert an inline element into block elements and vice versa. Let's look at some examples. So here we have created this boilerplate HTML document and linked it to our styles.css. We also added a title so that we know what the page contains, and we also added a page heading as a best practice. First, let's create an inline element and use span as example with some generic text, and let's assign it a class name called mySpan. Let's add background color and see how it renders. Now since span is an inline element, by default it does not take the full width of the page, as we can see by the yellow background color. Let's add some more CSS attributes like height and width. Since height and width do not have any effect on inline elements, the way the element is rendered is not changed. Now let's use our display property to change this element's behavior by setting display to block. And there you go, the span is now rendered as a block element. If we remove the width property, it will take up the 100% of the available width. For the next example, let's create a block level element using a div element. We have created this boilerplate div element and assigned myDiv as a class to this element. We will add same basic styles, background color, height and width to check how the element renders. As expected, it's a generic block level element. Now let's change the display property to inline and see. Now as you can see, we changed the block element to an inline element. Div is only taking the required width and height property does not have any effect on them. Now let's say we want to create an inline element but also want to control the height and the width of the element. How can we do that? We can do that by using a display value called inline-block. Let's look at the example. We have a regular paragraph which is a block level element and a class name myPara. We have added background color and set the display to inline-block. Now as you can see, the paragraph now behaves like an inline element. It's rendered on the same line and has width equal to the content. But it can also behave like a block element, so we can change the width and height of the element. This also works for inline elements. For example, let's create a new span element and set the display to inline block. Now we have an inline element where we control the height and width, so the element behaves like a block element. Just a quick side note, CSS3 has this new two-value syntax which changes the way we write some of the styles, but it is not widely implemented at the time of this recording, so we are not going to cover it in this video. Now, so far the examples that we saw affected the display type of the elements and its position in the normal flow. Let's look at some examples on how can we define the type of elements children, right? So let's start with a display value called table. The elements with display tables basically behaves like an HTML table and it defines a block level box. So let's look at the example. We have created a div element to act as a container for the table. Then we'll create a couple of div elements to be our table rows, and for each row we will create columns using more div tags and some placeholder content. Now let's also assign classes for our table, rows and column divs. Once the structure is created, let us add these classes to our styles.css. For the table class, we will add display table and some padding. Now since display table affects the content of the element, we need to set the values for the child elements too. So for the row class, we will add display table row. We'll also add some padding. For column class, we will assign display table cell and some padding. And let's also add borders to separate our cells. Now as you can see, our collection of elements is rendered as a table, and even though we have div elements over here, they behave slightly differently because of the display property. Next we have display inline table, which is similar to display table, but it creates an inline box instead of a block level box. Let's see an example. So we copy the table we just created earlier and just change the class name to inline table, and then add this class to our style sheet. We'll keep the class attributes similar and just change the display to inline table. Now if you see, we have two tables on our page and they look similar, but if you open the developer tools and check the width, one table takes 100% of the width and another table takes only the required amount of width. The whole table behaves like an inline element. This could be useful when we want to show multiple tables side by side. Next, let's look at a display value called list item. As the name suggests, list item allows us to render an element as a list item. Let's take a quick look. Let's just create a paragraph and assign it to list item class. In the class, we are going to say display is list item, and then we are going to set the list style to circle and set the position to inside. Now, as you can see, our paragraph has bullets next to it. Now, frankly, I can't think of a use case for this, but I would rather use semantic HTML and use unordered or ordered HTML elements to create a list. But it's good to know that there are different ways to do the same thing. Finally, next we have display none, and as the name suggests, we can hide an HTML element by using this property. Let's look at the example. So we have this regular div element with some placeholder text inside it. We have assigned a class called invisible to the div. Now let's add our class to the CSS file and just add background color for now. So the div renders as a regular block level element. Now we set the display property to none, and as you can see, the browser no longer renders this element. If you see the developer tools, the element still exists in the markup, but it's not shown and does not take any space in the normal flow. We can verify this behavior by simply toggling the display property. So there you go. These are some of the most commonly used display property values. There are few more display values like flow root, which in my experience are very rarely used, so I just decided to skip them for now. We also have display flex and display grid, which are very important, and so we are going to cover them in detail in the next video. I would definitely recommend checking out this display property documentation for more details and experimental features. The link is in the description along with the link to the code base. I hope this video was useful. If it was, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. In the next video, we are going to cover display flex, so I hope to see you there. Till then, adios, take care and stay safe.